Okay, so previously we were looking at the contribution of Alexandra Lemma and her notion of early implicit encoding, implicit procedural memory system and templates and so on. So coming back to MacLeod again, and he suggests that within the humanistic paradigm, as it moves towards integration, certain key trends can be detected, one of which is the integration of ideas from cognitive psychology. He suggests that, given that humanistic psychology is centrally concerned with the process of meaning making, the relevance of cognitive psychology has always been clear. So that's quite an interesting view from John MacLeod, saying that ideas from cognitive psychology may well influence and be imported into humanistic views. Just to go back to that slide from Lemma again, just to reflect on the fact that within this psychodynamic worldview we have this very psychological type cognitive language, implicit procedural memory systems, templates, models implicitly encoded as procedures. All this is a very cognitive type language, which MacLeod says we can also see being picked up in humanistic psychology. So just to take this a little bit further, this notion of schema, which we've now seen a number of times, we can liken Rogers's idea of the self-structure. Self-structure sounds very much like self-schema. Lemma uses the term schema in relation to self and relationship with others. MacLeod tells us that cognitive ideas are being imported into humanistic psychology, particularly if you look at the process experiential type view of the world, which also talks about emotional schemas. And in social psychology we have this notion of a self-schema, where people tend to have clear conceptions of themselves, i.e. self-schemas, on some dimensions but not others. People are self-schematic on dimensions that are important to them. This is very interesting because it almost directly reflects the statement by Rogers in the 19 Propositions that people, when they form their self-structures, may or may not attend to different aspects of their experience, and that for certain aspects of their experience they may not actually incorporate that into their self-structure at all. And here we have exactly the same notion in modern social psychology. And they go on to say, information about the self is stored as separate context-specific nodes, such that different contexts activate different nodes and thus effectively different aspects of self. And again, this is a very fascinating statement. So our self-knowledge is stored in context-specific nodes which different contexts may activate. So that if we're in a particular context, if we have to, as parents for example, go back to our old school perhaps, when our own children start at school, what will be triggered for us about ourselves when we enter that context again? And similarly, when we meet the headmaster at our children's school, what will transfer into our relationship with this new person based perhaps on the old relationship that we ourselves had with our old headmaster. And that, of course, is exactly the description that we saw earlier of the process of transference. So this notion of transference then seems to be very much tied up, or could be tied up, with this notion of schemas and representation. So thinking a bit more about schemas then, which seems to be a very popular idea at the moment within various different therapeutic models. And there is of course a therapy which calls itself schema therapy. I've just highlighted a couple of bits from a chapter in the book on schema therapy by Jung. So within cognitive psychology, a schema can also be thought of as an abstract cognitive plan that serves as a guide for interpreting information and solving problems. Thus we may have a linguistic schema, etc., etc. So Jung is just pointing out here that there is this notion of schemas in cognitive psychology, which is an organization, a representation. And he then goes on to define a maladaptive schema, which is a broad pervasive theme or pattern comprised of memory, emotion, cognition and bodily sensation regarding oneself and one's relationship with others, developed during childhood or adolescence, elaborated on throughout one's lifetime, and dysfunctional to a significant degree. This is remarkably similar to Lemma's earlier notion of some kind of implicitly procedurally encoded template that becomes activated when we're in relationship with other people. Pretty much exactly the notion that Jung is putting forward here in terms of a maladaptive schema. And in fact, if we were to modify that slightly, just remove a few words, you'd almost have the perfect cognitive definition of schema in actual fact. You only need to add in a few words to make a schema become maladaptive. So this is remarkably like, if not exactly the same concept of Lemma when she talks about templates. It starts to sound remarkably like the notion of a self structure described by Rogers in the 19 Propositions. So going back to the humanistic therapy, which appears to be becoming more cognitive according to John MacLeod, looking at emotion processed therapy, emotion focused therapy rather, Greenberg states, one focuses on evoking maladaptive schemes in therapy in order to make them accessible to new experience. So again, we see the notion of schemas in therapy. In fact, we've got the term maladaptive schema pretty much exactly as Jung uses it. So what about the CBT tradition? Here's an abstract from Chris Bruin, very thoroughgoing cognitive type abstract. It's talking about new metacognitive therapies, vulnerability to emotional disorders thought to lie in memory representations, e.g. negative self-schemas, etc., etc. So a very thoroughgoing cognitive abstract. Parts of this that I want to draw out then is that Bruin is telling us that there are multiple memories involving the self, so we're back to the self again, and memories that involve the self. And it is proposed that CBT does not directly modify negative information in memory, but produces changes in the relative activation of positive and negative representations such that the positive ones are assisted to win the retrieval competition. Now all that sounds like a huge mouthful, and if you sit and analyse and think about that, what it's saying is that we may have a bias to remember negative information about ourselves, and that negative information may be brought to mind by particular aspects of our environment or the context we happen to be in. And the way to change that in therapy, we can't remove those negative memories, we can't remove those negative attitudes people have about themselves, but we can start to build alternative positive ones and enable the person to practice living in that new positive identity such that the new positive ideas will come to the fore more often than the negative ones. Now compare that set of ideas with what Lemma said about therapeutic change. Therapeutic change is said to result from the elaboration and re-evaluation of current models that are implicitly encoded as procedures, leading to a change in the procedures that the patient uses in his relationships. If you compare those two sets of statements, in fact, it seems to me that after some pondering, they are in fact logically equivalent. That the therapeutic change enables the person to reevaluate current models that are implicitly encoded, leading to a change in the procedures that the patient uses in his relationships. So re-evaluation, a change in the relative activation. So what we've seen looking at these different ideas and this convergence of ideas across these different therapeutic languages is that we have within psychology and available to us through all these different therapeutic ideas explanations of the past and how people develop to become where they are, and how they have a view and an expectation about their future. So people have a trajectory through time. And in all of these different views, huge importance is given to internal representations, the ways I have encoded my experience, the templates I've formed, my self-structures, my schemas. Of course, we aren't just a vessel for representing the world at any given time. In the present, we have thoughts, feelings, drives, and behaviour, all of which, of course, psychology has a lot to say about. And all of this is replicated in the therapeutic relationship in that there are two people in the room, each of which has a past and are heading into a future, each of which has their own representations, their own current thoughts, feelings, etc. So we've looked at ideas about people and how they develop, and we can talk about people in relationship. And as people move from the past and into the future, we've seen ideas about how they can change. And my suggestion is that all of these ideas and all of these languages are part of psychology. What we sometimes don't do very well is make the psychology explicit, which is what I will move on to next.